vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces deux organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Basila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Ata Kakayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur. Et ensuite, qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local, chez nous, pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Cashew is an increasingly important crop for the countries in West Africa. For Benin, it's their second most valuable export. And we saw this big potential to grow and increase more.
Le cajou arrive en seconde place après le coton. À 110 000, 120 000 tonnes, en 2 ans, nous sommes passés à 120, 130, 140 000 tonnes. L'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'aller à 300 000 tonnes à la fin du quinquennat.
Cashew me permet de vivre. Au moment où je n'avais pas suivi avec Cashew Bénin, les 2 hectares font 5 sacs. Et maintenant, avec Cashew Bénin, je vends 15 sacs cette année. Le projet nous a appris beaucoup de choses.
Il a formé 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et 1 homme.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, mes impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Benin Cashew is an innovative program aimed at strengthening and growing the Beninese cashew sector. Its goal is to create a more productive, competitive, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth engine for the people of Benin. It's being funded by the USDA and is being implemented by TechnoServe and our partners at CRS. Over 8 years, Benin Cashew will increase the yields and incomes of more than 49,000 smallholder farmers, triple Benin's domestic processing capacity, create more than 3,400 jobs, most of which will be held by women, and will position the entire sector for continued growth long after the project ends.
Technicien travaille avec des hommes et des femmes pour bâtir des fermes et des entreprises compétitives qui contribuent à la réduction de la pauvreté, à l'augmentation de la résilience des bénéficiaires et de leur communauté. Nous restons convaincus que la participation pleine et entière des femmes et des filles permet de maximiser la croissance économique inclusive pour un développement généralisé. Au sein de la production agricole et notamment dans la filière cajou, bien que présentes, les femmes sont confrontées à des difficultés en ce qui concerne l'accès aux facteurs de production, notamment la terre, les ressources financières, la technologie et les formations. Au début du projet Bénin Cajou, la participation des femmes était d'environ 20,57%. À fin décembre 2020, ce taux est passé à 34,67% au sein de la production et à 39% au sein du projet. L'objectif étant d'atteindre au moins 40% de participation des femmes. Pour atteindre ce résultat, nous avons mis en place un dispositif institutionnel avec tous les partenaires du projet pour intégrer le genre au sein de toutes les activités de ce projet. Nous avons un dispositif basé sur des points focaux genre qui ont reçu des formations sur différentes techniques, différentes thématiques. Nous avons mené aussi un plaidoyer pour la modification des tests statutaires des fêtières des producteurs de cajou afin d'alléger les conditions d'accès des femmes aux coopératives. Et nous avons pu avoir une femme présidente du conseil d'administration de la fêtière des producteurs d'Anacad et une femme présidente du conseil de surveillance de cette même organisation, ce qui est une première au Bénin au sein de la filière Anacad.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes, surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'Anacad du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
J'ai constaté qu'avec cette formation, la femme a un grand rôle à jouer pour l'émancipation et la prospérité, bien partagée qu'à l'intérieur, qu'à l'extérieur, au sein du foyer. Grâce à cette même formation, la population, mais la communauté a un regard craintif en nous. Ils nous copient, ils voient la manière dont nous vivons avec mon épouse. Grâce à cette formation, nous avons pu réaliser beaucoup de choses.
Cette formation que nous avons eue sur le champ nous a réveillés par rapport à la femme, parce que dans le maillon production, on a constaté que les femmes n'ont pas assez à la tête, donc du coup, elles sont marginalisées. Donc sur le terrain, nous voyons en ce que les femmes sont prises en compte. Et comme le projet le recommande 40% de femmes, il faut dire que ce n'est pas facile. 40% des femmes dans tout ce que nous faisons, on doit pouvoir toucher au moins 40% de femmes.
Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest, we created from scratch a vibrant local timber industry. It did not happen overnight. we brought together local timber industry players and attracted foreign investors to create a competitive timber processing ecosystem. For this ecosystem to flourish, we attracted foreign investors, establishing linkages across the whole value chain, organizing trade shows for hosted companies to showcase and market their timber products, and boosting exports. GSE's Wood Cluster is now composed of 90 companies operating from the first to the third transformation of timber. All of them transforming ethically and sustainably sourced Gabonese wood. In less than 10 years, Gabon shifted from a net log exporter to the first exporter of veneer in Africa and second in the world. In fact, the real impact was much wider and more meaningful. With GSES, Arise IIP has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors coming from 18 different countries, operating in 19 industry sectors. In Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, our work is underway, following the same approach. Cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive.
Je m'appelle Sinagero Kalilaki. J'ai 28 ans. Je suis née à Ina, dans la commune de Bembereke. Je suis mariée et nous avons 2 enfants. Quand je me réveille, je fais d'abord mes travaux domestiques. Je balaie la cour, la chambre, je lave mes bols. Je prépare le petit déjeuner pour la famille et je viens travailler en pépinière. C'est en 2019 que j'ai commencé à collaborer avec le projet Bénin Cadeau. Quand j'ai connu le projet Bénin Cadeau, on est rentré dans le système de professionnalisation. Et dans ce système, à cette date, nous avons déjà reçu 5 modules de formation. En plus de la pépinière d'Anacadie, nous faisons la pépinière des manguis et des autres essences forestières. Après ça, nous faisons les cultures vivrières telles que le soja, l'arachide, le niébé. En dehors de ça, nous faisons le levage. On fait le levage des porcs et le levage des volailles. Pendant la pandémie du Covid-19, nous n'avons pas connu de difficultés par rapport à la main-d'œuvre. La main-d'œuvre était toujours disponible. La pandémie du Covid-19 a engendré des impacts dans notre entreprise parce qu'il y a eu la baisse du prix d'achat des produits. Bénin Cadeau nous a aidés. Parce qu'on continuait par suivre les formations sur la professionnalisation et à chaque formation, on recevait la réponse sur le Covid-19. Après ce programme de professionnalisation qui est toujours en cours, on a appris à faire le bokashi. Le bokashi nous permet d'augmenter la production. nous avons effectué un voyage en Tanzanie où on a appris beaucoup de choses sur l'agronomie de l'anacardier. Mes ambitions, c'est d'abord être compté parmi les plus grands pépiniéristes du Bénin. Aller à une production de 50 000 plants. Je veux avoir également un site moderne. Nous souhaitons que Bénin Cashew continue par nous appuyer surtout sur les aspects techniques de la production. Bénin Cashew nous a apporté beaucoup de choses, beaucoup de connaissances. Je remercie sincèrement le projet Bénin Cashew pour ses apports à mon niveau et de ne pas cesser de continuer toujours car on ne finit jamais d'apprendre.
En relation avec l'objectif du gouvernement d'augmenter la production, qui aujourd'hui est de l'ordre de 130 000 tonnes à 300 000 tonnes d'ici les 5 prochaines années, il s'est avéré nécessaire de disposer d'un matériel végétal performant de plantation, ce qui a amené le projet Bénin Cashew à accompagner la production de ce matériel végétal performant à travers d'abord les acteurs qui sont les pépiniéristes, dont la structuration a été accompagnée, et ensuite maintenant la recherche qui aujourd'hui fait l'objet d'un accompagnement à travers l'installation de 2 sites qui vont abriter les vergers de production de semences polyclonales qui puissent permettre d'atteindre l'objectif d'augmentation de la production de plants de la table.
En termes d'action, TechnoServe à travers Bénin Cashew a 3 axes. Le premier axe, c'est augmenter de façon quantitative les arbres mères. Ce que nous appelons arbres mères, c'est ces arbres d'anacarde qui peuvent permettre en réalité d'offrir des greffons aux pépiniéristes afin quand même d'offrir aux producteurs des plants greffés. Le deuxième axe d'intervention, c'est ces semences l'axe qui permet d'installer 2 vergers de production de semences polyclonales, un verger de 12 hectares à Ogui dans la commune de Savè et un verger de 12 hectares à Ina dans la commune de Bembereke. Le troisième axe d'intervention de Bénin Cashew en termes d'appui, c'est le renforcement des capacités. Et à ce titre, TechnoServe a pris l'engagement d'accompagner 7 jeunes et cadres au niveau du ministère de l'Agriculture pour les envoyer en formation.
TechnoServe nous a appuyés pour un voyage en Tanzanie. Et là, nous avons découvert de
très merveilleuses manières de travail, telles que le greffage sur bois mou. Nous avons aussi reçu les techniques de fabrication de bokashi. Le bokashi, c'est un engrais organique. Benin Cashew Technoserve a financé le voyage des experts d'autres pays qui sont venus nous apprendre cette technique de fabrication de bokashi.
L'Institut national de recherche agricole du Bénin a certaines faiblesses que la coopération avec Technoserve est en train de combler en termes d'infrastructures de conservation de ce matériel, en termes de ressources humaines capables de gérer convenablement ce patrimoine génétique. Nous avons déjà, avec l'appui de Technoserve, identifié des arbres élites performants d'Anacadier dont nous allons utiliser les potentiels pour dupliquer et avoir beaucoup d'autres matériels. Nous avons aussi avec Technoserve le contact avec des pays comme la Tanzanie et le Mozambique qui ont de l'expérience en matière de production de cajou. Et donc on pourrait bien les rattraper.
L'importance de l'installation de ce verger est d'augmenter la quantité de matériel végétal de qualité pour permettre aux producteurs d'avoir un rendement plus élevé à l'hectare.
Nous avons aujourd'hui 3 conseillers d'entreprise qui encadrent la cinquantaine de pépiniéristes dûment identifiés, sélectionnés avec l'appui du gouvernement pour que cette production repose sur des techniques managériales, entrepreneuriales qui permettent à ces pépiniéristes de jouer un rôle prépondérant dans l'atteinte de l'objectif de l'augmentation de la production de notre cajou.
Pépinériste, nous sommes les gardiens du matériel végétal, qui est un patrimoine pour notre pays. Donc sans le pépinériste, nos matériels végétal performants vont disparaître. Ce que Benin Cashew a fait pour moi, permettez-moi de le dire, ils m'ont beaucoup appuyé, surtout la formation des femmes. Donc on a eu à former 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et un homme. Benin Cashew est comme la levure dans la farine de blé qui fait lever le pain. J'ai pu avoir beaucoup de choses. Je me suis acheté un domaine où je suis en train de construire une maison familiale actuellement. Et à côté, j'ai prévu une pépinière. Avant Benin Cashew, je produis 5000 plants. Je suis aujourd'hui à au moins 12 000 plants. Je vois un futur radieux devant moi.
Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest, we created from scratch a vibrant local timber industry. It did not happen overnight. We brought together local timber industry players and attracted foreign investors to create a competitive timber processing ecosystem. For this ecosystem to flourish, we attracted foreign investors, establishing linkages across the whole value chain, organizing trade shows for hosted companies to showcase and market their timber products, and boosting exports. GSE's Wood Cluster is now composed of 90 companies operating from the first to the third transformation of timber. All of them transforming ethically and sustainably sourced Gabonese wood. In less than 10 years, Gabon shifted from a net log exporter to the first exporter of veneer in Africa and second in the world. In fact, the real impact was much wider and more meaningful. With GSES, Arise IIP has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors coming from 18 different countries, operating in 19 industry sectors. In Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, our work is underway, following the same approach. Cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive.
Dans ce contexte actuel de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la COVID-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. TechnoServe Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenue dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous les avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière cajou, Technoserve, à travers Bénin Cajou, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de Technoserve pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné l'ATDA et Technoserve à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cajou que ça a été organisé dans le Nord, précisément à Parakou. Et ça a permis aux femmes des 2 Nord de participer. Je veux dire à Takora Donga, Borgo, Albori, Zoukoline, le centre aussi. Voilà pourquoi je tiens à remercier très sincèrement Bénin Cajou. Et cette séance aujourd'hui nous a permis de partager les expériences des autres femmes. C'est déjà un plus pour nous. Et pour nous qui sommes arrivés, je nous demande à notre retour de passer l'information à celles qui ne sont pas venues, pour qu'elles puissent aussi être informées de ce que nous sommes venus faire. C'est ce qui manque souvent. Et ça fait que les informations, nous les gardons, et les autres n'ont plus d'informations aussi. Ça ne permet pas un développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager l'information avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière cajou au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de Technoserve via le projet Bénin Cajou.
Le projet Bénin Cajou a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Bénin Cajou a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête d'une femme, Madame Saadatou Atta Kakayachi, en tant que présidente du conseil d'administration.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, Les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère dévouée gère en subsidiaire son restaurant, son commerce de savon et mène des œuvres sociales en faveur des orphelins de son arrondissement. Brave et vaillante, elle exhorte son équipe et les femmes dans la filière cajou à se battre pour pousser loin la filière.
Pour réussir ma mission, c'est un engagement efficace de l'équipe. Ensuite aussi, il y a la disponibilité que toutes les femmes adhèrent aux coopératives de leur localité, entretenir bien les champs disponibles, celles qui n'en ont pas encore n'ont qu'à produire et surtout faire la vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces 2 organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Bassila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Ata Takayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur. Et ensuite, qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local, chez nous, pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Cashew is an increasingly important crop for the countries in West Africa. For Benin, it's their second most valuable export. And we saw this big potential to grow and increase more.
Le cajou arrive en seconde place après le coton. À 110 000, 120 000 tonnes, en 2 ans, nous sommes passés à 120, 130, 140 000 tonnes. L'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'aller à 300 000 tonnes à la fin du quinquennat.
Cashew me permet de vivre. Au moment où je n'avais pas suivi avec Cashew Bénin, les 2 hectares font 5 sacs. Et maintenant, avec Cashew Bénin, je vends 15 sacs cette année. Le projet nous a appris beaucoup de choses.
Il a formé 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et 1 homme.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Benin Cashew is an innovative program aimed at strengthening and growing the Beninese cashew sector. Its goal is to create a more productive, competitive, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth engine for the people of Benin. It's being funded by the USDA and is being implemented by TechnoServe and our partners at CRS. Over 8 years, Benin Cashew will increase the yields and incomes of more than 49,000 smallholder farmers, triple Benin's domestic processing capacity, create more than 3,400 jobs, most of which will be held by women, and will position the entire sector for continued growth long after the project ends.
Technoserve travaille avec des hommes et des femmes pour bâtir des fermes et des entreprises compétitives qui contribuent à la réduction de la pauvreté, à l'augmentation de la résilience des bénéficiaires et de leur communauté. Nous restons convaincus que la participation pleine et entière des femmes et des filles permet de maximiser la croissance économique inclusive pour un développement généralisé. Au sein de la production agricole et notamment dans la filière cajou, bien que présentes, les femmes sont confrontées à des difficultés en ce qui concerne l'accès aux facteurs de production, notamment la terre, les ressources financières, la technologie et les formations. Au début du projet Benin Cashew, la participation des femmes était d'environ 20,57%. À fin décembre 2020, ce taux est passé à 34,67% au sein de la production et à 39% au sein du projet. L'objectif étant d'atteindre au moins 40% de participation des femmes. Pour atteindre ce résultat, nous avons mis en place un dispositif institutionnel avec tous les partenaires du projet pour intégrer le genre au sein de toutes les activités de ce projet. Nous avons un dispositif basé sur des points focaux genre qui ont reçu des formations sur différentes techniques, différentes thématiques. Nous avons mené aussi un plaidoyer pour la modification des tests statutaires des fêtières des producteurs de cajou afin d'alléger les conditions d'accès des femmes aux coopératives. Et nous avons pu avoir une femme présidente du conseil d'administration de la fêtière des coopératives d'Anacat et une femme présidente du conseil de surveillance de cette même organisation, ce qui est une première au Bénin au sein de la filière Anacat.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont fortes, surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'Anacat du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
J'ai constaté qu'avec cette formation, la femme a un grand rôle à jouer pour l'émancipation et la prospérité qui est partagée qu'à l'intérieur, qu'à l'extérieur, au sein du foyer. Grâce à cette même formation, la population et la communauté a un regard créatif en nous. Ils nous copient, ils voient la manière dont nous vivons avec mon épouse. Grâce à cette formation, nous avons pu réaliser beaucoup de choses.
Cette formation que nous avons reçue de champ nous a réveillés.
The African Get your copy of the ACA Cashew Barometer. To access diverse industry data like RCN statistics comprising land area, yield data, RCN production volumes, CFR and farm gate prices, volumes of traded RCN. You can also have kernel statistics such as volumes of raw cashew nuts processed, quantities of kernels traded, and FOB prices. With the premium edition, you can view your chart in so many ways using Excel filters. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the ACA Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Today happens to be the 48th edition since we started this online forum. Before we continue, we'd like to appreciate our sponsors and partners who have made it possible for us to bring you these sessions every fortnight. And I'm talking about GIZ Move, SNI.
Recording in progress.
USDA Pro Cashew, Intersnack, and many others. Before I hand over to Jim, please note that this session is being held in English with a simultaneous French interpretation. To access this service, kindly click on the globe icon on your screen. Select a preferred language and mute the original sound. Should you have any question or need for clarification as the presentation is ongoing, we ask that you use the Q&A feature, and after the presentation, Jim will address all your concerns. Without wasting much time again, I'd like to hand over to Jim to take us through today's session. Jim, good morning.
Good morning, Blessing. Thanks very much. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Hope you too.
Yeah, I'm pretty good. I'd like to welcome everyone joining us again. I can't believe it's the 48th session that we're having, but I'm looking forward to it. I was at the World Cashew Conference recently, and I was talking to a lot of people, and we got a lot of thoughts. And I saw this quote in a newspaper here in Ireland. At no time in the last 4 years has there been more confusion, more mixed signals about the future direction of the global economy. And I thought, well, that's a bit like cashews, isn't it? It is, as someone said to me recently, perfectly balanced. And I thought about it, and I thought, actually, maybe it's perfectly unbalanced. So I thought, let's talk about some of these issues. So the market has really never been more difficult to read than right now in March 2023. So if you feel confused or indecisive, join the club, because almost everyone does. So today we're going to look at some of those factors that are causing this perfect imbalance, as I've termed it. And we're going to try to get to the bottom of some of the issues that have brought us to this point. So we'll start with a production update, some news from various producing countries, and then we'll talk about these mixed messages or the apparent contradictions in the cashew market. And then at the end, there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers. So if you want to ask a question, if you want to contribute, if you want to disagree, particularly if you want to disagree, feel free to either type a question into the questions and answers box or raise your hand and come online, and we'll have a chat about whatever's on your mind, and maybe we could get to the bottom of these issues. So let's start with a look at production. And we probably should remind ourselves before we do that of the spread of production around the world, how Africa remains in 2023 the major production region, especially West Africa, with almost half of the world's cashews grown there. But we should also remind ourselves that Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Vietnam, to a lesser extent Thailand and Burma, have become really significant in terms of their production. So now with the growth of Cambodia, about 25% of the world's cashews are grown in that region, most of those in Cambodia, of course. And India maintains its position, and East Africa, despite a not too great season in Tanzania, maintains its position around 9%. So that's where cashews are grown. So let's have a look at some of the news, and we'll start in Asia, the big processing countries and what they're reporting. So in Vietnam, lower than expected crop based on the initial estimates. Quality and quantity is likely to be lower. Now, that doesn't mean a huge amount for overall global production, because Vietnam is somewhere between 7 and 8% of world production. So a slight fall in Vietnam doesn't make an awful lot of difference to the overall picture. But what we are seeing in Vietnam right now is lower quality product, mostly due to rain damage, and lower prices as a result. If we look in Cambodia, which really is the driver of production growth in recent years, the estimates now still quite a wide range, from 800,000 to 1 million tons, but that's well up from the 700,000 tons of last year. If we look at prices in Cambodia, quite high at the moment. The last price I heard was $1,300 at the farm gate, undried. Most of the Cambodian cashews are sold to Vietnam undried and then dried when they arrive in Vietnam. Prices then are lower than last year. In fact, pricing at the farm gate in Cambodia has been quite volatile in recent years, and that may be part of the reason for the decline in the hectares. Now, Cambodia is really interesting. We've seen Cambodia grow dramatically over the last 4 years, mainly based on new high-yielding varieties. But we also noting that some of those varieties are quite vulnerable to poor growing conditions and quite vulnerable to pests and diseases. And that means that farmers in Cambodia need to work hard, invest in their trees, spend a lot of money on inputs, giving them a different cost profile to, let's say, similar farmers in West Africa. Now, in return for that, they're getting very high yields. But there must be questions in the longer term as to where some of the Cambodian trees are planted and whether that makes sense, and how many of them have been planted. So we may well see in the coming years Cambodian production stabilize around the current levels. If we look at India, well, speaking of stability, Indian cashew production has been relatively stable for a number of years. The initial forecasts are unchanged from last year. We're still looking at very slow growth, although friends in India tell me that we might see faster growth in Indian production from next year. Certainly there have been a lot of efforts made to try and improve production. So we're coming to the end of a period when production in India has migrated from the very southern part of the country to a much wider area of production. And now we may well see production start to grow again. But I don't think we're going to see anything like we saw in Cambodia or we saw in Côte d'Ivoire 10 years ago. So the impact of the situation in Asian producing countries is probably an increase of somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 tons. That's balancing a poor enough crop in Vietnam with a much better crop in Cambodia. Probably, I think it's wavering toward the higher figure there. So that would mean depending again on which estimate you take, somewhere between 2 and 6% increase of the global crop. If I had to pick a number, I would say that probably you're looking at 4% right in the middle of those two figures. Have to have a quick look at the demand and inventory of RCN in Asia. This is critical at this time of year. Has a big impact on how the sales of raw cashew nuts from West Africa will go. So if we look in Vietnam, you see big numbers, you see 200,000 tons as a stock figure. It sounds like a big number, but it is only about 1.25 months processing stock. I suspect that forward sales are much lighter now. The fall off in demand in the US market and slower European market mean that there are fewer forward sales than you would normally have expected. So remember that at this time of the year, normally Vietnamese processors would have heavy forward sales, and they would buy buying raw cashew nuts to meet those sales. That's probably a little bit less the case this year, but they have been importing. So in the first 6 weeks of the year to the 15th of February, Vietnam Customs reports very strong imports, up by 73% on last year, which, if nothing else, shows a degree of confidence. But exports are down 10%, even on last year. Now, let's not overemphasize that, because it was not until later in the year, in 2022, that we saw exports affected. Actually, January, early February last year was quite good. So 10% down is not necessarily an indicator of what's to come. Looking in India, demand appears to continue strong. The inventory of the 2022 crop of RCN is selling. Imports look to remain pretty strong. Indicators from various sources in India suggest that the market is likely to continue to grow. One analytical agency suggests another year of about 15% growth in India. I must say that would be remarkable, but it's possible. Either way, I think we're going to see fairly strong imports of raw cashew nuts into India. I don't think this year we will see a return to growth in exports from India. Exports of kernels from India have been falling for many years. I think probably the root of that is about 15 years ago. But we may well see India return a little bit to the export market toward the end of the year and into 2024. Again, I don't think enough to disrupt the current market pattern. Looking at Cambodia, well, much better crop. They don't carry inventory in Cambodia. Everything is sold out. Some processing. There are some factories in operation, but it still looks as if 95% of the raw cashew nuts go to Vietnam this year. Interestingly, some Indian buyers of raw cashew nuts have been expressing interest in buying in Cambodia. Some have visited. There have been over the years light imports, but we're talking very light. We're talking in the hundreds of tons from India, from Cambodia into India. There's no reason why that shouldn't continue, but it would be interesting to see how Indian processors would appreciate the quality of Cambodian raw cashew nuts. So let's just focus in then on Africa as a region. And the driver of production in Africa is the largest producer of cashew nuts in the world, Côte d'Ivoire. Forecast this year around about 1.1 million tons. Reports from the first flush, from the first crop, not so good. So reports that rainfall may have damaged flowering and that this may be a little bit less. Now, we have seen that before, and it hasn't actually impacted the overall volume, but it is something to be followed. Farm gate prices are high at the moment. There are stocks from 2022, but I don't think they're problematic. Elsewhere in West Africa, most countries, Nigeria, Benin, Ghana, Togo, Guinea, I had an opportunity to speak to people from all of those countries recently, all reporting good crops. Guinea-Bissau, we saw some good reporting during the World Cashew Conference, and it looks like a good crop in Guinea-Bissau, but there are some unsold stocks there, I think possibly currently under negotiation. So overall in West Africa, we see a situation where I think the stocks are probably less. The 2022 crop carry in is probably less than it might have been expected because of the good support from India for imports in the latter part of 2022, reducing stocks, particularly in countries like Guinea. There are stocks, Guinea-Bissau, estimated around 50,000 tons. That's quite a lot. Côte d'Ivoire, somewhere between 60 and 85,000 tons. Now, that's anecdotal reports. That's not really a lot in the sense that it's less than a month's usage between exports and processing in the country. So although you may see some mixing of all crop stocks in Côte d'Ivoire, that should exhaust itself fairly quickly. Overall production higher than last year, I think, in West Africa by 5 to 7%, but we should always, in March, be a little bit cautious because the initial forecasts are often overly optimistic. So we often get forecasts from growers, forecasts from traders and governments particularly, where they tend to overestimate the crop for that season for lots of different reasons. Overall, where does that leave us on production in the world, according to me? Well, I think we're going to have a record crop. I think we're going to have a crop that is, again, better than last year, better than 2021. And all of this volatility in recent years has really been down to the volatility in Cambodia. So in 2020 to 21, the huge increase, from 21 to 22, then a decline in the crop in Cambodia and an improvement then again. So whereas 5 years ago, we would very much have been saying that West Africa was the driver of volatility in production, I think we can now say that it's really Cambodia that's doing that. Now, overall, that probably means production for this year up somewhere between 5 and 7%. Quite a healthy situation. Production continues to grow, but I think we do need to bear in mind that with Cambodia having risen so quickly, and with questions over many of the areas in Cambodia that were planted to cashews, and with the ability of Cambodian farmers to change when they see the opportunity or the need, and the high cost of inputs, we have to be very careful before we just assume that production will continue in this pattern. As we've seen, and we saw this from 2017, 18, 19, when production growth was driven by West Africa, it was relatively stable. So the days of fast growth in West Africa appear to be gone for now. There are significant opportunities for growth in Nigeria, in Benin, in Ghana particularly. But for now, we're looking at Cambodia as the driver, and therefore we're looking at a relatively high-risk situation in terms of growth slowing or growth being lost in the coming years. But for this year, looks like a good crop, 5 to 7% up on last year. That'll make it a record crop. So moving away from production, then, we're going to talk about some of these, what I'm calling mixed messages and mismatches. So these are some of the factors in the market that we're all fairly familiar with at this point, but that nonetheless continue to bemuse many of us. So things like the fact that raw cashew nut prices in the international market don't tally with cashew kernel prices, that farm gate prices, particularly in West Africa at the moment, in some areas, don't match the export prices for raw cashew nuts, that lower prices generally in the market, lower prices for kernels, have not been affected, have not managed to increase demand. So it appears to be against the basic law of economics. Lower prices and falling demand at the same time. And we'll have a chat about that. And then something that's, I must say, surprising to me, but it is a fact, that the demands, sustainability demands of buyers are not being reflected in the prices paid by those buyers. We'll ask the question, are buyers actually serious about sustainability? Let's start with the first of our mixed messages and mismatches, and that is the situation with regard to raw cashew nuts and cashew kernel prices. So what we have here are 5 examples, and they are examples, right? So this is not perfect. This is an indication. This is different for every factory. But if we look at it and take some general examples, so using Ivorian raw cashew nuts, I just priced them in at $12.50. Cambodian raw cashew nuts at $1,300 at the farm gate. I've taken Vietnamese processing costs at $150 a ton, so we're only talking about efficient factories. And in Cote d'Ivoire, I took $4.50, which is probably, some are better than that, some are worse, but it's a much more general representation of costs there. And if we look at that, we see the put together price of 320s in the bars So, for example, the blue one is Vietnamese processing of Cambodian raw material. The red is Vietnamese processing of Ivorian raw material, Indian domestic material, India processing Ghanaian raw material, and a very efficient factory in Côte d'Ivoire processing locally. And what we see is that the current value of 320s, represented by this dotted line, is very close to cost. And this is the conundrum, that how can the market function when the cost of the product put together, either from locally closely imported raw cashew nuts or from raw cashew nuts imported from half a world away, we see this problem of cost and market. And that makes margins for processors extremely tight. The Indian situation is a little bit different. We see that the costs are a little bit lower compared to the market price in India. Prices in India are higher. The market is a protected market. Indian processors appear as if they can make money, and I think some of them can. But at the same time, when you look at it, it's a pretty tight calculation. I mean, you really wouldn't invest in processing today based simply on that calculation. If we look in Côte d'Ivoire and take probably an optimum example, we see that, yeah, origin processing in that case can be profitable. Now, bear in mind that this calculation is only for cashew kernels. It doesn't take into account any benefits of the sale of byproducts. So Vietnamese processors have been benefiting from the sale of byproducts over the last couple of years. In contrast, Ivorian processors have not. So it's an indication, but I think it's reasonable to say that we're not seeing a situation where processing is attractive in the way that you might say that I could buy raw cashew nuts today, process them, and sell the kernels at a profit. And that's a measure of risk, and it's a measure of efficiency, and it's a measure of the sustainability of the current market situation. How long has this been in place? Well, if we go back to March 2022, it was actually a pretty similar calculation. So on the left-hand side, you can see the calculation from March 2022, which I presented on this GME, and it's not that dissimilar this year. So that means that profitability in processing, particularly in Vietnam, has been poor, or for some non-existent for more than a year. From Vietnam, we hear processors, importers telling us that the answer is lower RCN, that raw cashew nuts should be lower by perhaps $200, $250 a ton. And you can see their point when you look at the calculation. But on the other hand, we see Indian buyers being able to buy imported raw cashew nuts and make a profit. And that's not going to change. So we have this situation where two gigantic processing countries, one for re-export, Vietnam, one for domestic consumption primarily, one can pay a much higher price than the other and still be profitable. And that is one of the significant mismatches in this market. It's not simply about lower RCN prices. We could ask the question, are kernels underpriced? And then we'd say, well, okay, kernels are at 10-year lows. Is that underpriced? Or we could say, is RCN overpriced? And then raw cashew nuts are trading around about 5-year averages. So they're not particularly high, they're certainly not low. So this gets us into a really difficult situation. The obvious answer would be, well, kernels are way too low at 10-year lows. It doesn't make sense. Let's have a look and see how this situation arose. So here we have the trend since July 2019. FOB WW320 cashew kernels from top processors, mainly based on Vietnamese processors. So we're talking here about minimum BRC processor, reliable processor. And we just look at the trend. So back, COVID arrives and we get this decline in price. Meantime, throughout that period, 2020, 2021, into the beginning of 2022, with very, very strong demand in the European Union and in the US, remarkably strong demand. Then comes a period last year from February, and not just from February, because this started before, where we had the war in Ukraine, advent of vast inflation and a lot of economic uncertainty. Prices continued their downward spiral. The interesting point is it continued. And at different points in that period, there were little periods of panic on price. Markets dropping down, people selling at $2.40 for 320s, for example. US demand was poor. China was in and out of the market. China is about 9% of the world demand, but is important for Vietnam, particularly seasonal demand. But we noticed that the decline in price started before the war, before inflation started to kick in. The decline in price started around about September 2021. Having built a significant recovery after the COVID panic, prices then started to fall in Vietnam. And that really is the root of the problem, that period there, because prices were low when we got the impact of inflation and economic uncertainty. And if we look at that, we think that dropping prices, which I think was a deliberate decision, dropping prices during that period did not reverse the trend in demand, because it was not about price at that time. It was not a case where a lower price would stimulate demand. And I think there's a number of factors here. I think perhaps processors didn't know their customers very well, that they didn't recognize that the 2020-21, first quarter 2022 boom had to come to an end at some price. So looking at this and thinking, this is how we got to a position where at one point WW320s hit $2.40, the lowest price since 2008, I think. They're now recovered somewhat, but you would still have to come to the conclusion that although RCN short-term might be a little bit overpriced, that the fundamental issue here is that cashew kernels are underpriced. And that is actually self-inflicted to a large extent. But it will take time to heal. On the one hand, RCN will be supported by continued strong demand in India. Buyers will buy. You know, how do you stop the market from going up? Stop buying. But you can't stop buying when you've got demand and you want to process and you're in business. On the other hand, it'll take some time for buyers in Western countries, in Europe and the United States to react to prices. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. So this mismatch looks set to continue, but I would still maintain that the kernels are underpriced, and that's where the greatest possibility of some volatility, which also means risk, in the coming 12 months. Let's have a look at some of the farm gate prices. So this is the second mismatch, farm gate prices and export prices for RCN. And I'm a little bit less sure on this one, I have to say. Because farm gate prices in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, tell us a different story. They would tell us that actually RCN is overpriced when you look at it right now. Because if we look at this chart, so here we have in dollars converted from CFA, farm gate minimum price, the actual farm gate price reported at the moment, the delivered price to factories, the export costs, and an estimation of profit margins for export traders. And that would give us a total cost around about $1,000, but offered prices range up as high as $1,200. Now, they are offered prices rather than traded prices. But you would see there is something of a mismatch here between the farm gate price. So right now, people telling us that farm gate prices in Côte d'Ivoire are too high for export RCN might be contradicted by looking at the values in the marketplace. And therefore, we may see a slight retracement in the offered prices for raw cashew nuts in the short term. That assumes, of course, that the crop in Côte d'Ivoire continues to be a good crop. Any disruption to supply, any crop problem, any bad weather would change that calculation. So the second of our mismatches doesn't really appear to be a mismatch, it just appears to be a short-term marketed phenomenon. What isn't short-term and what has been going on for some time is the third mismatch, where we're looking at lower prices and at the same time falling demand. So we ask the question, why is demand in the US and the European Union not responding to lower prices? Let's again have a look at the situation as it arose. So throughout January 2020 until April 2022, we saw the import boom for cashew kernels in Western markets, particularly in the US, but also in the European Union. By September 2021, we started to see a sustained fall in prices. By the second quarter of 2022, buying had completely fallen away. Prices started to drop. We started to see these 10-year lows. We had tested them in late 2021, but a return to those again in the second quarter of 2022. And from July onwards, imports, so that means shipments probably starting in May, into the United States, into the European Union, into Canada had started to fall away. And the fall in the US was quite dramatic. 19% down on the full year last year, but 35% down in certain individual months in the second half of the year. Europe, again, quite significant falls year on year, but over the year, we're waiting for the final figures, probably down by 3 to 4%, not overly significant. But if we look at the second half of the year, there was a sharp fall away. So when we saw this import boom, let's have a look at how did the market react? What happened? So strangely, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, processors, export processors, reacted by dropping prices. That was based on fear. It was highly influenced by the situation in China, and it was based on the fear that there would be a demand crash. Of course, that didn't happen. What happened was that there was an absolute boom in imports into markets in the West, a kind of staccato response in China, responding to lockdowns. It would be open, then it would be closed. Demand in India, of course, slipped back, highly affected by the restrictions around the pandemic. By the time we get to the end of this period of import boom, the expectation for continued high volumes amongst importers and amongst roasters was there. Inventories were high in anticipation of further disruption to shipment. But as that faded away more quickly than people expected, inventories started to rise. Then we got impacted by the fear of economic slowdown. Buying was halted, not initially because demand at the supermarket level was down, but because companies looked at costs, they looked at supply chain. In the boardroom, they decided, we're not going to take any risk on this. And I think there was an impact of cashews being lumped together with all of the tree nuts. General decisions were made. Demand starts to slow down. At that point, prices, because we'd set prices quite low at the beginning of the pandemic, they never fully recovered. They started to slide again in September 21. Imports are now falling, despite the market at 10-year lows. So imports in reaction are different. Some buyers started to delay their contracts, causing a lot of trouble. Some buyers, unfortunately, defaulted on their contracts. And in the end, last November, incredibly, US supermarkets actually increased the prices at retail, due, they say, to other costs. So what we see was a really bad signal in dropping prices fairly illogically twice, once at the beginning of the pandemic. Secondly, in September 21, this sent a really strong signal that lower prices are available and that something is wrong, essentially. And so during a period of low prices, we see the largest ever decline in imports over a 6-month period. Let's have a look at the reasons then. So first of all, most simply, most obviously, it takes time for demand to react after a drop in price. Now, normally, a reaction, like in 2017, we saw a slowdown following high prices. This is completely different. This is not just based on the price of cashew nuts. This is based on a whole range of other factors. It's not even based simply on an economic turndown. As we saw in 2008-9, we saw about 4 months of a decline in imports based on economic circumstances, and that turned into quite steady growth the following year. Now we're seeing a whole host of factors, and just like I said at the beginning, in the general economic picture, it's never been less clear than it is at the moment. But there are other factors. There are factors that might have corrected this situation. And I think this one of the big issues, in my opinion, is that processors, exporters, importers sent all the wrong signals. And I think they did that. I put down KYC, that's know your customer. And I don't think we do. I don't think we spend time trying to understand what our customers want. I don't think we spend time trying to understand how their businesses work. So when we drop prices, particularly Vietnamese processors, we should bear in mind that roasters or supermarkets are not traders. They buy and then they stop. They don't buy more because it's cheaper. They're not speculators. Secondly, if we lower prices after our customers have bought, it makes the buyer, the individual buyer, look bad in their own company. And it makes them more cautious, and it makes them less likely to take advantage of the next low price opportunity. Lower prices reduce the value of inventory. So if inventory is high and prices are falling, it's not just the next purchase that's impacted, it's everything that's in the warehouse. And that can create a lot of problems, especially for importers. Lower prices, particularly the kind of sharp, illogical fall that we've seen, create a situation where one roaster can undercut another roaster, again undermining confidence. Overall, in this situation, good, reliable buyers tend to feel frustrated. And the bad buyers, or the more risky buyers, well, they just default on their contracts. And that's what we've seen. So my view on this is that dropping prices from $3, first at the beginning of the pandemic and secondly later, was unnecessary. That it wasn't actually driven by demand at that time. It was a knee-jerk reaction to a notional set of circumstances. Prices dropped in a demand boom, but the signal sent was that prices should be low, that prices can be low. Supermarkets, roasters, they don't know if you're losing money or not as a processor. And by the looks of it, they don't care. So we've sent a lot of poor signals. Now we're in a different situation now. Inventories are lower. Inflation is receding slowly, or it's expected to recede. Costs are normalizing a little. Freight has come down a long way. Anyone in the raw cashew nut business will know that. Energy prices are at last falling. So people are still, consumers in Western countries particularly, are noticing that they're still getting very high bills for their electricity or their gas, but that these bills are going to be lower next month, lower the following month. So we're in a different situation now. So when we look at the market as it stands, we see we're probably in a situation of, let's call it, fewer unknowns. And buyers are seeing mixed signals. So they're seeing the crops are good, no denying that, but RCN prices are higher than kernels. That's the mismatch we started this conversation with. We see that low kernels prices persist from processors. You can go out there today and you can buy 260, 265 for WW320s. Now, I'm not saying that's from the ideal supplier, but the price is available. And if you just, if you're a buyer who doesn't buy directly from the origin, you just read the emails every day and you look at the prices, you probably don't know the difference between a top processor and a processor that probably should be at a lower price. So they see lower prices persisting. We know that forward cover is relatively low, which is typical of this situation. I wonder how low forward cover is. I suspect it's as low as it's ever been at this time of year. And we see some importers offering very low prices for forward shipments. And I'm struggling to understand that too. Prices based on current FOB prices. We're seeing that processors generally do not know their customers' needs. Now, that may be because they sell indirectly through an importer or a broker. It may be because they still think, like commodity traders, that they're trading a product, not a service, not a resolution of a problem for their buyer. And they're also seeing now the chances that Vietnam will compete with its customers. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is by going into processed products, going into roasted packed consumer packs, which is ambitious and which is an interesting strategy and maybe a highly successful strategy in time. But the message the customer receives is that my supplier is going to compete with me, that they will be perhaps able to do it cheaper, and that I will lose some of my business as a result. So within these 7 factors, let's just take from the African processor's point of view, and let's think, as an African processor, do you know what your customer needs? Do you know how their market works? Are you actually talking to them about that? Are you assessing how you can do business, what problem you solve for them? Or are you getting embroiled in all of these 7 factors, the mismatches and the contradictions? So if your customer is telling you, well, I can buy cheaper in Vietnam, and that's the end of the conversation, then you need to talk more about what the customer needs, and particularly, is that the right customer that I'm trying to deal with? But there are opportunities. So one of the main opportunities that we saw or thought we saw was our next mixed message. And that was the case of sustainability. Sustainability, important for buyers, especially important for buyers in Western countries, especially important now that the law has started to change for care of the environment, care of workers and suppliers in the chain, factors such as traceability. And if we look at some of the factors, so if we look at the increase in processing in Africa, both by volume and the increase in processing by percentage of the crop, it would seem to indicate yes. This is from this slide is called the African Processing Revolution. We're going to talk about that during the next GME. So certainly there is an increase, and we know that in 2022, African cashew kernels, for the first time since the 1970s, went into double-digit share of the European market, which is a remarkable change. But on the other hand, if we take a look at this, so this is the US share of the market by Vietnamese cashew processors, who we know are the lowest cost in the world. And the high level, 89%, hovering between 89 and 90% in recent years and growing before that. This says, clear message, you would have thought, from the US market that, guys, price is more important to us than sustainability. Because as we know, Vietnamese processing is based on over 2 million tons of imports on average in recent years. And finally, if we look at some of the launches of products, one is from the US, one is from the UK, I believe. But this doesn't say anything good about sustainability at all. In fact, I think it says we don't care. Vietnamese cashew kernels, labeled as Vietnamese cashew kernels, Vietnamese jumbo roasted cashews, jumbo wrapped cashews, excuse me. These are almost certainly from Africa, and these are almost certainly from Cambodia. So what does that say about the belief in sustainability of buyers in Western countries? Now, it's not all buyers, but it is creating a frustration for African processors that find that buyers are interested in their USPs, their unique selling propositions, their sustainability, but they're not prepared to pay for it. And this is strange because it's often the buyers who talk most about sustainability who are the most difficult when it comes to price negotiation. And therefore, we have to address a question to African processors. Are you actually talking to the right customers? I think that's really an essential question when we look at competitive advantages of African processing: sustainability, USPs, traceability, responsibility, all of those factors. Are you talking to the right customers? If you're finding that you're getting all of these things thrown back at you, maybe you're talking to the wrong customer. So let's have a look then at our 4 mismatches and just think about them and summarize on them a little bit. So cashew kernel prices and RCN prices mismatching. And really what we're seeing strong Indian demand, poor marketing of kernels, and that's what I'm getting at when I talk about a logical reduction in price, not knowing your customer. That's about poor marketing. That's about not really understanding what makes your customer tick. And then the interest of traders, whose interest naturally, and they perform an important function, the interest of traders is to get between the two and to try and make money out of it. And we need them to do that, because until we have high levels of processing in West African countries, we need an RCN market and we need someone to handle that. So right now what we see is in Vietnam, I feel processors getting squeezed. They're getting squeezed between the high demand in India and poor marketing of kernels, which has led to these low prices. Roasting, value addition, consumer packs is not going to solve this problem. It's being presented as the answer. But it isn't actually the answer, because roasting, consumer packs, export to high-value markets is even more demanding in terms of its marketing, food safety. So if you're unable to market a raw cashew nut, an unroasted cashew nut, a cashew kernel, well, what makes you think you're going to be able to handle the food safety requirements, the quality requirements, the marketing requirements for a roasted packed product? So actually what we're seeing here is a strain between the decommoditization of kernels and the commodity trading culture in the RCN business. That will only change when origin processing grows and starts to dominate the market. Second factor, well, I don't think that this farm gate price versus export prices for raw nuts is a mismatch. I think what we're seeing some early season spikes in prices, which we often see. They might be a little bit more exaggerated this year, whilst Indian buyers try to work out what's happening in Benin. Indian buyers love Benin RCN. It's coming to market a little bit later this year, and the situation is unclear as there is on the horizon for 2024 a ban on the export of raw cashew nuts from Benin. If we look at our question about lower prices and falling demand, isn't it normal in economics that lower prices mean more demand? Well, they do, but we're in a very specific set of circumstances right now. So we need to look at the calendar, and we need to think about time, and we need to think about not if this will reverse, because it will. We need to think about when will it reverse? And that is a huge question. The most optimistic people I talk to say maybe in the second quarter of this year. Second quarter starts next month. And right now, there's not much sign that this is beginning to change, certainly not at the supermarket level. time will tell. And our final contradiction, the contrast between the willingness to pay a fair price and the demand for sustainability. And I think this is about marketing. I think this is about how you talk to your customer. I think it's about which customer you deal with. How do you identify your customers? How do you select your customers? And I think it's this thing about selling the problem you solve, not the product. So the problem you solve as a processor is about sourcing, traceability, impact, sustainability, environmental responsibility, not about 320s. Because if you just sell a product, well, most days you're going to be able to buy that product at a lower price in Vietnam. So those are a mismatch. We're not seeing any easy answers here. We're going to see some of these problems resolved naturally in time, I think. Raw cashew nut prices and cashew kernels prices, that must resolve itself eventually. But it may well need some structural changes and rationalization in the industry before it's finally resolved. Some of them will be resolved in time. But some of them, and there I address African processors particularly and those that support them, some of them will need action. Action in marketing, action in storytelling, action in branding, action in promotion. But all of that must be based on a fundamental understanding of our customers. We need to know our customers better. Those are some of the mismatches, some of the talking points I'm anticipating over the next 2 weeks. I think we need to look at the crop progress in Cambodia. It's the key factor, it's the key balancing factor in supply and demand in 2023. We need to look at the Ivorian situation, the initial progress on that first crop, and the possibility of rain damage. Is there rain damage? If there is, how bad is it? We keep an eye on the farm gate price as a reflection of that. Need to look at the international RCN prices. Will we see some easing of prices from exporters, particularly looking at the export origins which are primarily focused on selling to Vietnamese processors? We can see in countries like Ghana, Benin particularly, that the Indian buyers will support that raw material, but whether or not Vietnamese processors will support material from Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and elsewhere remains to be seen. We need to look at the impact of reduced processing capacity in Vietnam. The situation that we've just been talking about is not without impact on processors, and we know, I think, that there has been a reduction in the capacity, and that may be in different areas. It may be in the smaller outlying factories, it may be in some of the larger factories. We'll have to see what the impact of that is over time. Vietnamese cashew sector is predicting lower exports this year. I'm not sure demand will actually be lower this year. I think demand might be higher this year, but it would encourage a reduction in capacity, and that will have an impact on the availability of kernels. We need to keep an eye on China. So China, we would expect this year to return to a more normal import pattern. Last year, Chinese imports were pretty healthy, but they were still significantly down on the kind of levels we saw pre-pandemic. And finally, we need to take a look at US buyers. I think we probably will see activity in the US market in response to price first. And when we see that, it will be a big clue as to the next direction on cashew kernel prices. So they are not a very encouraging situation at the beginning of 2023. Production remains encouraging, but the market remains filled with these mismatches and contradictions. I've tried to give you my view on some of them. I hope you found it interesting, and I will pass you back to Blessing to see if there are any comments or questions. Blessing.
Thank you. you very much, Jim, for the presentation. Yes, we do have some questions here. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions or need for clarification, there are two ways to go about it. You either drop it using your Q&A feature located on your screen, or use the raise hand feature, and then you will be called upon to ask your question directly to Jim. Without taking much time, Jim, the first question says, with the impressive growth in production from Cambodia, what are they doing differently that Africa can learn from? Should Africa's big producers be worried? Over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Blessing. What are they doing differently is that they developed high-yielding varieties, very high-yielding varieties. They're using quite a lot of inputs, and it is something that's happened over a significant period of time. So the development of high-yielding varieties, which was mainly developed by the private sector, the distribution of those seedlings, and the management of those trees with fertilizer, pesticides. It remains to be seen if this is a long-term strategy, but certainly there would be good learning in terms of the development of varieties. Now, I know that's quite common across African countries, and there have been some excellent varieties in Tanzania, Cote d'Ivoire, for example. More recently, I think there's work in Benin. But I think what is astounding in Cambodia is the implementation, mainly private sector implementation, that the advent of this research turned into production within less than 10 years. Should African big producers be worried? Well, if you're in the cashew business, you're probably always a little bit worried, but I don't think you should be worried about loss of demand. I think the underlying trends in demand are strong. I think at the moment we are in a difficult period. We're probably coming towards the beginning of the end of that, but I wouldn't be too worried. I would be proposing that work on post-harvest improvement in quality and definitely the development of origin processing continues to be a good idea. I wouldn't be concerned that their demand will be so low as to not absorb the production in the future.
Thank you very much, Jim. And the second question, you said Vietnam's export has declined. Does this mean consumption has increased in Vietnam?
No, not necessarily. Consumption in Vietnam is a very small proportion of the crop. Vietnam's export declined last year simply due to a lack of demand in importing countries. Mind you, that doesn't necessarily mean that consumption has declined either. What we're seeing is that Vietnam has a high share in markets like the United States. So last year, US imports were significantly down by 19%. So half of the decline in Vietnam's exports last year, I think it was actually 53% of the decline in Vietnam's exports were related to the loss of markets in the United States. That was mainly due to a decline in imports in the second half of the year. So it does mean that consumption has decreased outside, but it doesn't mean that consumption has increased. I think maybe this question might also be more related to India, where the increase in consumption in India and the reformulation of the market and government policy has caused exports to decline. So in India, we see that exports have declined dramatically over the last decade. And this has been related to a major increase in consumption of cashew kernels in India, which has been going on for decades now, but which really gathered pace 15 years ago and again now last year.
Thank you very much, Jim. The third question says, the decline in Vietnam's production, could it be related to Cambodia?
No, I don't think so. I think Vietnam's production had been declining for some time. Vietnam's production almost touched 500,000 tons at one point, and it has declined now where it's somewhere between 350 and 400,000 tons in a good year, and somewhere between 300 and 350 in a poor year, which is like this year, I guess. So I don't think it is related to Cambodia because it started well in advance. I think the decline in production in Vietnam was probably due to the fact that there were better things to do, more profitable things to do on those soils in those areas. And farmers in Vietnam are pretty smart, and they reacted to that. And some of them took out their cashew trees and put in some other crops, cassava, rubber. Interestingly, we're seeing a little bit of a trend in Cambodia, a similar trend in Cambodia over the last 18 months or so. So that's one of the reasons why I say we need to keep a close eye on what's happening in Cambodia for the long-term production trend.
Thank you very much, Jim. The next question says, what do you think about a global law or standard for processors to abide by to avoid the 7 biased mixed signals?
Well, I think processors should engage more in marketing. They should embrace, what they call the decommoditization of cashew kernels. So start to treat it like a food, like an ingredient. Start to know the customer better, even if you're not dealing directly with the customer, even if you sell through an importer, to talk to the importer to understand what the end buyer needs, to understand how to talk to buyers. And I think one of the things that I would say is that trade associations in the kernels exporting countries could have a big role to play in how they present their market. I mean, if one looks at the buyer's attitude, and I'm talking about the up the chain buyer, I'm not talking about the first importer, their attitude to Vietnam, essentially their feeling is that there's unending supply of cheap cashew kernels and that the prices can be low and lower. They look at Africa, they think cashew kernels probably going to be a higher price, but there's certain advantages on that. They have a rough idea of those advantages, but they don't really know what those advantages are. Why don't they know those things? Because nobody tells them. They don't know those things because we don't have the kind of marketing approach. There's no global marketing initiative to promote cashews. There's very few and very weak national initiatives to promote cashews. We, as a sector, don't tell our story very well. I'm not sure that there could be a global law or standard for that. In fact, I doubt there could, but I do think that it would be very constructive if we started to talk about this, and particularly if our trade associations, regulatory bodies in Africa, NCAN, ACA, CCA, the associations in Benin and elsewhere started to talk about marketing and promotions, and that will need a bit of support from governments too. So I think a lot of work needs to be done on this, but it's probably not law, but global practice, improvements, discussion could be really important. I mean, if the sector has come quite a long way. If you think 5 to 7 years ago, nobody even talked openly about the cashew market. The information was very difficult to find, but now it's much more available in all countries. So there's a lot of work to do in that area, to my mind. It's an interesting question. Could there be a standard for processors and marketing? In a way, maybe there is. I mean, if we talk about food safety, there are certainly standards. So maybe practice guides, organizations like the Global Cashew Council and trade associations to get involved, talking to their counterparts in the importing countries. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. We have some more questions here. And the next one says, will FOB kernel prices increase or decrease in the coming month?
I think my guess is that we might see a slight increase in FOB kernels prices in the coming months, but it might be toward the end of that 2 to 3 month period. I think the downside is very limited. I think that given where we are on pricing, it's pretty unlikely that prices will fall again. So I think, I'm more friendly toward the market, but I'm reluctant to make any big predictions on this one because we have had a relatively stable low price market for some time now. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. I have another question here which says, will demand surpass supply in the in West Africa this season?
Will demand surpass supply? I don't think so. I think the market is relatively balanced. I think we'll get a similar pattern to 2022. Almost all of the raw cashew nuts will move. There will be a small carry-out. We don't see any huge increases in production. I think kernels exports will increase. So a relatively balanced situation, but there will not be a shortage. There will not be a situation where demand surpasses supply, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Jim. There's another question here which says, what is your view on local demand in India? Will it grow during the coming year?
My view on local demand in India is essentially based on the people I've spoken to over the last 4 or 5 weeks. And generally, I get a pretty positive view on demand in India in the coming year. People are talking about good demand. They're talking about strong expectations for demand as the year goes on. So I think, yes, it will grow. Probably not as quickly as it grew last year. Anecdotally, definitely, if I look at official reports, if I look at some of these agencies analyzing the Indian market, I see very strong reports, and they too believe that demand will grow this year. However, I think that some of their predictions, I read one predicting another 15% growth. I think that might be a little bit high, but yeah, definitely, I'm convinced that demand in India will grow again this year.
Thank you very much, Jim. I have exhausted all the questions that were dropped in the Q&A session, and there is nobody's hand raised to ask any question directly. So maybe before we bring the session to an end, what are your concluding remarks?
Well, I think when we look at these contradictions in the sector, I think we need to very carefully consider how do we tell the story of cashews, especially African cashews. But it also applies worldwide. We don't do a particularly good job of promoting this product, building buyers' awareness, and meeting buyers' needs. If we don't do that, we're going to be faced with continued volatility in the sector. And volatility is the most difficult thing to deal with, whether you're a processor, a farmer, and particularly if you're a buyer and a user of cashew kernels and you want to launch new products. So I think that addressing these mismatches, if not reversing them, if not fixing the underlying problems, at least to be able to explain them to customers, at least to be able to explain to customers why the raw material is costing more than the value of the kernels that they're trying to buy, why African kernels are more sustainable than kernels exported from elsewhere, why the arguments in favor of origin processing are so strong. We need to tell the story better. In the short term, I think this year we need to keep a close eye on production. Look at the big countries, look at Cambodia, look at Côte d'Ivoire. I think if we see any hint of renewed kernel buying, and I mean promotions as opposed to just taking short windows of cover, then we might be seeing the start of a recovery in kernels prices. I wouldn't be surprised if kernels prices finish the year higher than they are now. I wouldn't be surprised if we get to the middle of the year and we see that rise in kernels prices. Until we see some momentum behind that, it's going to continue to be difficult times for processors. And it's going to be a time when, if we get any difficult, unexpected news, that we will see a reaction in the market. So keep a close eye. It's not a time, in my opinion, for taking risks. It's a time to get on with business and take advantage of this period to, as I say, tell the cashew story better. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Jim, for another insightful presentation. And to our participants, we thank you for joining us. Once again, we also like to appreciate our partners and sponsors who have continually supported us to bring this session to you. We would communicate the next date to you in no short time. We ask that you subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can always replay the sessions and follow us on our social media platforms. Without wasting much time again, I'd like to announce that we have a date for the 17th ACA Annual Cashew Conference. The 17th ACA Annual Cashew Conference will take place from the 18th to the 21st of September 2023 in Dakar, Senegal. In the coming weeks, registration will start, and we ask that you take up the opportunity, register early, and have amazing discount. Without wasting much time again, and of course, to liberate you, we ask that you stay safe and see you again. Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.
A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 70%